So today you're going to be writing about your experience this morning, and that kind of text is called a personal recount. So we're going to be looking at some of the features of a personal recount before we get started. So our learning intention is to understand how to write a personal recount. Just some revision on a personal recount, which is something that you've written many times before. If you come back from the holidays and your teacher asks you to write about your holidays, what you're doing is you're writing a personal recount. So a personal recount firstly retells events. And because it's retelling events that have already happened, they use the past tense. And they usually retell events in chronological order. And chronological order means that the events are placed in the order that they happened. Because a personal recount is a narrator writing about themselves and their experience, they're written in the first person. So the sentences will be about I or me or my experience, or if it's a group of people like your family, we went to Disneyland, etc. It also, as well as events, it includes your personal response to the events. So you might talk about things that you said, you might talk about what you thought at the time, and you might talk about the things that you felt as you experienced the events. So here's an example of something we might write this morning. This would be a start. It seemed like any old Monday morning, except that my teacher, Miss McAllister, wasn't at assembly. Miss Wheatley was asking us if we had seen her, and she looked concerned. At this point, I wasn't really worried. When we walked down to our atrium, we realised that something really wasn't right. There was caution tape tied across the entrance, and I could see through the window that someone had made a real mess of our atrium. There must have been an intruder. Firstly, in this example, we can see that the narrator is retelling the events in the past tense, which we can see with the verbs like seemed, wasn't, was asking, had seen, looked, wasn't. And also these events are in chronological order. So first we arrived at school, then we had assembly, then Miss Wheatley was asking if we'd seen Miss McAllister, then we walked to our atrium, then we realised that something wasn't right, then we saw the caution tape, then we looked through the window, and then we saw the mess. Also, we see example of first person. So we're talking about my teacher. Miss Wheatley was asking us if we had seen her. We're using I because I wasn't worried. And sense impressions and personal reactions to events. So this is the things that we see or think or feel as we are part of the events. So firstly, it seemed like any old Monday morning. So that's how Monday morning seemed to me. That's a personal impression. When we say that Miss Wheatley looked concerned, that's our perception of Miss Wheatley. That's us looking at Miss Wheatley, and we sense that she is looking concerned. When I say I wasn't really worried, I'm talking about my feelings in response to the situation. As we go down to the atrium, we realized something really wasn't right. So that's us, my personal experience, and me sensing that something's not quite right. As I see through the window, that's my reaction. So I see the caution tape, and then I decide to look through the window. And finally, there must have been an intruder. That's my opinion based on what I'm seeing. Okay, so some verb groups you might have noticed in here that we're going to focus on today are highlighted in yellow. First one is had seen, had made, and must have been. So we're going to look at why we use these verb groups. And to answer the question of why we use them, we need to look closely at the order of events. So if we go back to that idea of chronological order, here we have 8 events in order. So first I arrived at school and it felt like a normal day. Next, assembly started. Then Miss Wheatley, looking concerned, asked if we had seen Miss McAllister. It didn't worry me. 5, we walked down to the atrium. 6, we saw the tape. 7, we saw that someone had made a mess. 8, we thought that there must have been an intruder. So these are the events in the order that they happened. But if we look at these verbs here and we think about the point in time, what time do you think these verb groups are pointing to? Have a think about that for a second. The highlighted verb groups are pointing to an earlier time, so they're actually going backwards. So Miss Wheatley asked if we had seen Miss McAllister. Well, if we had seen Miss McAllister, that would be happening somewhere back here, or somewhere back here before the assembly started. When we see that someone had made a mess, the person making the mess, this would have happened either before assembly started or before we arrived at school. And finally, there must have been an intruder. This would have happened before the point in time that we're talking about. So each of those verb groups point back instead of forward. So to do this, we need the past perfect tense. And the past perfect tense is formed with a subject, had, and a past participle verb. And in this case, in this example, that's the verb left. So we use this to point back to an earlier time, and we do this when we're already using a past tense. So for example, by the time I arrived, the bus had left already. So we're using a past tense, which is the blue, and we're pointing back before that using the past perfect, saying the bus had left already. So you can see that the time we're describing is here, and we're pointing back to an earlier time. That's what the past perfect allows us to do. Here's another example. Miss Wheatley asked if we had seen Miss McAllister. So we're at this point in time, and we're pointing back to an earlier time. And to do that, we've got our subject we, had, and our past participle verb seen. Again, we saw, that's our past tense, our past simple tense, that someone had made a mess. Whoops, we're going backwards. So someone had made, we've got our subject, had, and our past participle, allowing us to point backwards. All right, so we can move in chronological order. So the events that we're describing are in chronological order, but every now and then we want to point backwards to something. And for that, we're going to use the past perfect. Must have is very similar. Must have points backwards in the same way that the past perfect does, but it also signals to the reader that this is an opinion. It might not necessarily be true. So, when we say, there must have been an intruder, this is the narrator's opinion about what happened before. It might not be true. So you can see a similar structure. We've got our subject, must have, and our past participle verb. Instead of using must, we could use could or might. So there could have been an intruder would make sense. There might have been an intruder would make sense. But there must have been an intruder tells the reader that the person writing is very certain about that opinion. So another example of that would be Miss McAllister must have been terrified. We've got our subject, Miss McAllister, must have, and our past participle verb been. So some more examples. The intruder could have escaped through the window. It might have been a teacher who did this. So now, with the person sitting next to you, you can see if you can finish these sentences using the past perfect.